Right. Good evening and welcome to Arrowling Cardiff, and the first in a series of teachings entitled Battlecry of Freedom. For anyone who doesn't know us, I'm Ngakpa ö-Dzin, and this is Ngakma Nor'dzin.
Hello.
Ngakma Nor'dzin is the author of the book Battlecry of Freedom, which explores the 7 points of mind training by Chekhawa Yeshé Dorje. This evening's teaching will be recorded and eventually appear on YouTube and possibly other places also. I have the role of administrator for the evening. I will mute everybody, but questions can be asked at any time. And if you want to ask a question, you can raise a hand via the Zoom raise hand facility, or you can use the Zoom group chat, whatever you prefer. And I will try and keep an eye on all of that as and when questions arise. So now I'm very happy to hand you over to Ngakma Nor'dzin for the evening's teachings.
Hello, thank you very much for coming along to this tonight. I am extremely enthusiastic about these teachings. I sort of lived and breathed these teachings for several years in the writing of the book, and I continue to be very enthusiastic about the teachings. And they are very much a part of my life as a practitioner. I think there is a danger with these teachings to tame the teachings instead of taming the mind. So to train the teachings, perhaps, rather than training the mind. And I think for me, this, I'm taken back to the very first time that I heard these teachings. Fortunately, I can't remember who it was who was teaching it me then. But they seem to emphasize the slogan aspect of the teachings rather than the profound depth and breadth of these teachings. And so I remember a workshop at that session of teachings where we were encouraged to write our own slogans. Now, for me, this is a little bit like being given a transmission of what Dorje Purba looks like, and then being told to go into another room and paint your interpretation of what you think Dorje Purba would look like. That is absolute nonsense. These slogans express a complete body of teaching, and although there are various versions of them and various interpretations of them, it isn't our place to tinker with them. Our place is to enter into the dimension of these slogans and embrace them as a way of living our lives as practitioners. For me, one aspect of understanding the depth and breadth of these teachings has been very much feeling my way into their place in history. So tonight, I'm mostly going to talk about this historical context of the teachings in the hope that I can put you in that historical context as well and get a feeling for how these ancient teachings existed in the first spread of Buddhism, or arose from the first spread of Buddhism, rather than arising from the second spread of Buddhism. So let's have a look at some dates. Chekhawa Yeshé Dorje lived from 1101 to 1175. So he's a 12th century practitioner. But Buddhism first arrived and was first established in Tibet in the 8th century. The king of that time, Trisong Detsen, was following on from his predecessor, who had succeeded in uniting the clans of Tibet. Tibet used to be an incredibly warlike country, a very powerful country. It dominated the other countries of its borders, such as Mongolia and China. We tend to think of it as this idyllic, peaceful place at the time that we first came into contact with it in the West. But its history is extremely stormy. Many stories of conquering this part and being conquered by that part, other countries nibbling at its edges and Tibet fighting back. So Tibet was a very warlike nation. And the king, whose name I've forgotten to write down,
Songtsen Gyalpo.
Thank you. He managed to unite the clans, and kind of following on from that, uniting the clans, Trisong Detsen, the 8th century king, very much wanted the Tibetan culture to develop and to become as rich as the Indian culture. At that time, India was very much the place that was looked to for culture and morality and spiritual development and spiritual maturity. And so King Trisong Detsen looked to India, to how the teachings of India could be brought into Tibet and established there. And he brought in 2 teachers, Guru Rinpoche, Padmasambhava, and Shantarakshita. And at this stage of the history, the 8th century, they established 2 streams of Buddhist practice. Shantarakshita established the monastic stream of practice. This is sometimes known as the red Sangha, because they wore red skirts and mostly red clothing. And then there was the non-monastic Sangha, the yogic Sangha, it's sometimes called, the Gokar Changlo, and they're sometimes known as the white Sangha because they wore white clothes and different sort of costume. Now it's important to see that these were established as being complementary to each other, of equal value to each other, of equal value in their own right, not in competition with each other, but 2 approaches to the practice of Buddhism. And Padmasambhava, he came from India, he was a Mahasiddha, and his approach to the way that the teachings were presented is based in that Mahasiddha tradition of India. And that the essence of that approach to the teachings is that what you are is your method of becoming realized. That you don't have to give everything up in order to become a realized being. You just engage in being really what you are. So the Mahasiddhas came from all walks of life. There were prostitutes, a weaver, a potter, people who had disabilities, a whole range. There was a thief and a gambler. And the teachers that they found showed them how to embrace what they were as their method of practice and gain realization through that method. So Padmasambhava was teaching this tradition of discover what you are and that is your path. You don't need to change the reality of your life, the reality of perhaps the profession you've chosen. You simply have to engage in that in a totally real and focused and direct manner and liberate that into the realized state. The other side of this was Shantarakshita, who established the monastic tradition, but the monastic tradition at that time was very much that the Sanskrit teachings were translated in terms of the sensed and realized feeling of the teachings. The monastic path was one of renunciation, of renouncing the world in order to engage in the teachings from that perspective of renunciation, rather than the perspective of transformation, which is what Guru Rinpoche presented. So this is what was established in the 8th century, these two streams of Buddhist practice, the Gokar Changlo and the monastic tradition, and they were seen as equal. In fact, at that time, it would be quite realistic to say that the Vajrayana tradition that Guru Rinpoche established was stronger in Tibet than the monastic tradition. There were more disciples of Guru Rinpoche than there were of Shantarakshita, and that community grew more quickly and more vividly at that time than the monastic tradition. So then in the 9th century, Trisong Detsen was followed by a king called Rinpoche, who continued this work of establishing the Buddhist teaching, establishing the Buddhist teachings as the cultural framework for how Tibet was to develop, as well as a spiritual framework. But Rinpoche made the mistake of going for this so completely and investing so much money in it, so much of the wealth of the country in it, that the tribe leaders became unsettled. They'd been quite happy about Buddhism being part of the culture and being developed, and Vajrayana fitted in very well with their understanding of how they could be practitioners but still be the aristocracy. But Rinpoche started to develop the monasteries and put lots and lots of money into that side of things, and they became extremely worried that all the funds were going on this, that Tibet would lose its status as a warlike country, as a powerful country. And so they started to be unhappy about this, and poor Rinpoche was assassinated. And he was followed by a king called Langdharma. And Langdharma felt that Buddhism was a big problem and needed to be got rid of. So he persecuted the monasteries. He tried to wipe out the monasteries. Monasteries were ripped apart, people were forced to give up their robes, and to all visible purposes, Buddhism disappeared in Tibet because the monasteries disappeared. And this is, having been a golden age of Buddhism, as it is often called in the history books, this is called the Dark Age of Buddhism, or the Dark Age for Tibet. But one thing that anybody who studies history at any level of any country will very quickly realize is that how history is interpreted depends very much on who's writing it. And it's very difficult to get a very clear image of the reality of the history of Tibet, particularly as many of the histories that are written have a prejudice or have a wish to move the history in a direction that suits them. So this is often called a dark age for Buddhism, a dark age for Tibet. But if we hear about what happened next, we can come to realize that actually this was the fantastic era for Vajrayana Buddhism. Langdharma succeeded in destroying the monasteries, and he tried to go after the Gokar Changlo as well, to try and destroy that aspect of Buddhist practice in Tibet. But Chekhawa Yeshé, a great Vajrayana practitioner of that time, is said to have manifested a scorpion the size of 9 yaps in front of Langdharma. And this just frightened him a little bit. And so he left the Gokar Changlo practitioners alone. He didn't attempt to wipe out that aspect of the teachings. So what we actually have happening in Tibet at that time is 150 years of Vajrayana left to get on with it on its own and flourishing. Now, we have been most fortunate in our lives and our history as Buddhist practitioners to have contact, personal contact and contact through our own teachers with many extraordinary modern day Vajrayana practitioners, such as Ngakma Dorje Rinpoche, who we met, Jomo Sampel, who is still alive and we know. We've also met Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, Tarchen Rinpoche. The names could be endless, Kyabche Shimi Rigzin Rinpoche. Some of these great lamas of our recent era may have dressed and looked like monks, but they were not monks. They were Vajrayana practitioners in the style of the Gokar Changlo day, continuing the teachings that were flourishing in this period that many historians call the Dark Age. So the way it would have worked at that time is that the Gokar Changlo would have just carried on practicing. You can't suppress practice that happens at that level. If the local teacher is just the doctor or the yak herder or the blacksmith or somebody who runs a store in the village or a nomad who wanders from place to place, they may have many disciples who come to them. Those disciples may come in secret even. There is no way that any king can control that. There's no way a government can control that because it's existing in people's homes and people's communities. You could go to Yangula place in Nepal. It's Parping, is it called? Parping is the Nepalese name. And if you didn't happen to know that this great Mahasiddha, Kyabje Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche, lived there and was this great Vajrayana practitioner, you might meet him in a shop and you just think he was this ordinary man. There was no way of knowing unless you were a practitioner and you made it your business to find out who these great practitioners were. But there would have been many practitioners in many places in Tibet who just simply continued the practice and had a body of disciples, and these practices were not particularly ritualistic. There was not necessarily a lot of instruments being played, texts being chanted, not necessarily any of that very visible aspect of practice going on, but nevertheless that practice was there and it was flourishing. And so Tibet had these 150 years of Vajrayana thriving. Now, if you're a king of the country, or if you have aspirations to be a great king of a great country, then one of the problems with this style of practice happening in your country is there's no way you can control it. You can't even identify the Vajra masters of these little groups of disciples, let alone attempt to control them. And to those groups of disciples, the Vajra master is the king. The Vajra master is the person to whom they look for guidance and instruction. It isn't possible to control that Vajrayana style of practice. But in the 11th century, mid-10th into the 11th century, along comes a person called Yeshé Dorje, who wants to proclaim himself as a god king. And this leads to the second spread of Buddhism in Tibet. Now, depending on which history books you will read, he will be presented as a savior of Buddhism or as somebody who suppressed Vajrayana Buddhism as it was there flourishing in Tibet at that time. And really, it will depend on where you place yourself as a practitioner within the schools of Buddhism and what the experience of your own teachers, of how they've been taught the history of Tibet, how you will regard this situation that arises there. I am presenting the Nyingma view here, but another school may present a different view. But the Nyingma view is that Vajrayana Buddhism was alive and well and flourishing in Tibet. But it is true to say that monasticism wasn't. There were tiny pockets of monasticism, but monasticism was not a major part of what was happening in Tibet because it had been so completely suppressed in Tibet. And so what Yeshé Dorje did and his followers did, he reintroduced monastic Buddhism into Tibet. And he brought in teachers from India, because India was still looked at as the place, the source of all the great teachings of Buddhism at that time. And so he looked to India to bring in Buddhism back into Tibet to re-establish monastic Buddhism. And he invited this teacher called Atisha, who came to Tibet in 1042. I think it's also quite interesting to see that Atisha is a contemporary of Marpa, Tilopa, Naropa, Niguma. Machiglabdron was a little bit later, but they're all in that sort of time period. Machiglabdron herself surely has to be an example of how Vajrayana was flourishing. She is an incarnation of Yeshid Sogyal, the Tibetan Buddha, the Tibetan female Buddha. Buddhism wasn't in a bad way in Tibet. Buddhism was flourishing as Vajrayana in Tibet at that time. When Atisha was taken to Samye, the great Buddhist monastery that was established at the time of Trisong Detsen in the 8th century, when he looked at the translations of the Indian Tantras, he said they were extraordinary, that they were absolutely perfectly translated, that the essence of the teachings had been completely understood. And he was amazed at the quality of these teachings that existed there. But to get back to Yeshé Dorje, what he wanted to do was to establish in Tibet a form of Buddhism that could be controlled. So he wanted to establish a form of monastic Buddhism that was in the control of the ruling bodies of Tibet at that time. And so the style of Buddhism that arose at that time was that if you became a monk, it was a little bit like sending your child to boarding school or attending a university. That it was a very organized manner of entering into Buddhist practice, of studying Buddhist practice. And it was about at this time that we start to hear about people being called a geshe, that they took this great body of teaching and that they received this qualification of geshe after they had followed this program, which I believe can take up to 25 years to follow this program. But it has to, I think that these new schools of Buddhism and this form of monasticism that was established at that time, it didn't reject the Vajrayana Buddhism that existed there at that time. This came later, quite a long time later. So people at that time may well have taken monastic ordination, but taking monastic ordination was not a sign of rejecting the Nyingma, what came to be known as the Nyingma, the ancient ones. It wasn't a sign that they were rejecting the Vajrayana Buddhism that existed in Tibet at that time. It was just that there was this new opportunity to train in Buddhism in a new and concentrated way with the support of the government, if you like you got a grant for your monastic training, which is something that hadn't existed in Tibet. So it was a new and exciting opportunity for practitioners. But the style of the second spread was dictated, it was controlled. The monastic setup was controlled, and it became more and more over the next few hundred years established that the government and the aristocracy involvement with the monastic organization, they became completely enwebbed with each other. It became a completely inseparable thing, culminating in about the I think it was the 14th century, with the Gelug tradition even becoming in charge of the government and establishing the Dalai Lama as head of government and head of the monastic training, the monastic style of practice there. So it's important to understand that as Westerners who have come into contact with Buddhism in a modern setting, that what we see as Buddhism is actually Gelug, because the Gelug school by that time completely dominated Tibetan Buddhism. The other schools still existed, but it was the Gelug school that was so completely dominant of the style of monastic practice. And the Gelug monasteries were like little cities. But and every family might send one child to become a monk. This was a standard cultural thing to do. And the people who lived and worked the land didn't own their land. It was often owned by the monastery or the local aristocracy. So it was a very feudal society that was organized in that manner. So it's important, I feel it's important to place ourselves where Chekhawa Yeshé Dorje, the person who wrote the 7 points of mind training, to place him in his historical setting. He's described as a Nyingma. He was born into a Nyingma family, which basically means that he was born into a family that practiced, because all there was at that time was Nyingma. We now know it as the Nyingma school, but that was simply ancient Vajrayana Buddhism that existed in Tibet. That was the Buddhism of Tibet at that time before the second spread. And in the second spread, which happens in the 10th, 11th centuries, I'm really bad with this. I can never remember whether 1100s that's the 12th century. I really have a problem with this, and numbers are not my best thing. So Chekhawa Yeshé Dorje was born just at the beginning of the 12th century, and Yeshé the king who re-established monastic Buddhism, his dates were 959 to 1040. So he was the end of the 10th century and the beginning of the 11th. Is that right?
Yes.
So that style of Buddhism, by the time Chekhawa Yeshé Dorje was an adult, that monasticism had only been established for about 100 years. So the Vajrayana Buddhism of the Nyingma school was still very much there in the back as the backbone of practice in Tibet. But Yeshé wanted to discredit this style of Buddhism because it didn't fit in with his scheme of a controllable monastic Buddhism for Tibet. Now I'm a little bit reminded of the Welsh language here. We're in Wales, and the Welsh language has undergone a similar sort of process in being suppressed. At the beginning of the last century, the British government decided to suppress the Welsh language. And by about the 1940s, 50s, you correct me if I'm wrong, children were not allowed to speak Welsh in school.
Earlier.
It was even
late
earlier.
1800s, yeah.
Right. They were not allowed to talk to each other. The children were not allowed to talk to each other in Welsh. Official business was not allowed to be conducted in Welsh. So what happened to Welsh? It stayed in people's families. It survived because it existed in people's families. I remember once being at a Welsh class, and a woman who was there at the class with me said she'd started learning Welsh. She didn't know she came from a Welsh-speaking family until she started speaking Welsh. And then her grandmother started speaking Welsh to her. So here it is a little bit in reverse, that Vajrayana Buddhism was being taught in people's homes. It was being taught in secret. It was there as a flourishing undercurrent of Buddhism. And Yeshé, I think he was cleverer than Langdharma, because Langdharma just said, let's just destroy everything I can see and that'll get rid of Buddhism. But I think Yeshé was a bit cleverer because he didn't try and destroy anything. He just tried to prejudice people in terms of their view of what was there in Tibet. So these great Mahasiddha practitioners who existed hidden, or hidden if you didn't know where to look for them, were called black magicians. You were told that the cities they manifested, the power that they gained was dangerous, that the mantras that they gained their power through were magic spells. That was one approach. The other approach, which our teacher, Ngakpa Rinpoche, taught about the other day, was to make them so special that ordinary people could not aspire to it. So, oh yes, there are these incredible practices and incredible Mahasiddhas, and they wear this particular style of dress as practitioners of this Vajrayana practice. But oh no, you can't wear that dress, because who do you think you are? Are you saying you're a Mahasiddha by wearing that dress? So even the wearing of the Gokar Changlo costume, the sort of costume that we're wearing today as Ngakmas and Ngakpa, this sort of costume became rarefied. People didn't wear it because they were afraid that people would think they were trying to say, oh, I'm this great Mahasiddha, I'm this great practitioner. And these prejudices were kind of seeded into the view of the Nyingma school. And the Nyingma school still suffers to this day from these historical prejudices are there against, particularly against the Gokar Changlo Day. And we have certainly personally experienced that. We've been practitioners for over 40 years, and we started off by receiving teachings from the monastic branch of Buddhism, but quickly realized that this was not the path we wanted to follow, and were very pleased that we met with Ngakpa Rinpoche and Khandro Dechen and were able to follow the teachings of the Vajrayana practices and take Vajrayana vows rather than the Vinaya vows, the monastic vows. But we were told that it didn't exist. The Gokar Changlo doesn't exist. No, that's something that's been made up. It's not real. We have experienced a terrible amount of prejudice against us. In fact, we've actually been banned from the shrine room of a local Buddhist center. Unless we go not in our robes, because we've been told it will confuse people too much, that only the monks and nuns are allowed to wear robes in their shrine room. So it is very sad that this prejudice that dates right back to the 11th century is carried forward and continues. So I think Yeshé and the people who followed him actually were really quite clever and really did quite a good job there. So let's now return to Chekhawa Yeshé Dorje. He hears about the teachings of Atisha. Atisha was the teacher that Yeshé brought into Tibet to re-establish the monastic style of practice and re-establish the monasteries in Tibet. Now, Atisha was definitely a great practitioner, and a practitioner more from the lineage of the Mahasiddha style of practice. And the mind training teachings, he taught these as an oral teaching. As far as we know, he never wrote this teaching down. There are no records of him having written these teachings down. the first person, I think, who ever wrote these teachings down was a man called Langri Tangpa. And he died a little bit after Chekhawa Yeshé Dorje was born. And Chekhawa Yeshé Dorje heard about Langri Tangpa's teaching, which was entitled The 8 Verses of Mind Training. And he was so taken by these verses that he set out on a journey to find this teacher, to receive this teaching.
May I interrupt a moment?
You may.
We have a question from Peter.
Mm-hmm.
I think referring to prejudice against the Gokha Chanlo Day, was it in the West or also in the East?
It's also in the East. So, for example, Jomo Sampol Dechen Rinpoche, who is the wife and Sangyom of Kunsan Dorje Rinpoche, cannot wear the white skirt of the Gokha Chanlo in public because she would receive a lot of negativity from people. And Kyabje Shimi Rigsin Rinpoche used to wear a red skirt, not a white skirt. I think this is perhaps becoming less true as time goes on, but yes, the prejudice is there in Tibetans as well as in Westerners. It isn't there in the same way in Bhutan. It was wonderful when we went to Bhutan to recognize Bhutan as a Vajrayana country, and that there isn't that prejudice there. You see Gokha Chanlo practitioners everywhere, and they, just as that in a Nyingma practice, you will always find a mixture of Gokha Chanlo and monastic practitioners engaging in practice together. That was very much in evidence in Bhutan. So when we were in Nepal, maybe 2 visits ago, we took part in a Tsogkholo practice that lasted a day with Wangdu Rinpoche. And the in a Nyingma Gompa there, and the Gendun, the Sangha, were a mixture of Gokha Chanlo and monastic monks wearing monastic robes. And there was no sense of a hierarchy there. They were just practitioners practicing together. And the Umze, the leader of the chant, was in fact one of the Gokha Chanlo practitioners. So it doesn't exist in the Nyingma, but it does tend to exist in the other schools. I don't want to say anything negative about the other schools, because each school has its own path that is completely valid path for gaining realization. That is without question. But as a Nyingma practitioner, I think one has to be aware of this prejudice. When we first went to Nepal and were there in our robes, we experienced a lot of aggression from monks, quite unpleasant behavior from monks. But that has changed. That isn't true anymore. That has dramatically improved. We are very fortunate that the academics, having done all the study that they could possibly do about monastic Buddhism, the monastic Buddhism of Tibet, did move on to looking at the yogic traditions. And as soon as the academics started producing books about the Gokha Chanlo Day and evidence of the existence of the Gokha Chanlo Day, then it was much easier to say, well, actually, yes, we do exist. We've always known we exist, but great, thank you for telling us we exist. That's wonderful. So we can practice a little bit more easily now in terms of being visible.
Also from Peter, was this from academics in the West?
Yes, that's right. The academics in the West studied the Gokha Chanlo. So if you can try and imagine that you're Chekhawa Yeshé Dorje, you've been brought up in a Nyingma family, so you will know about Vajrayana practice. You'll know about essentialized practice that isn't just about chanting texts and studying ritual and studying Buddhism in an academic sense. You will understand what it means to practice. He heard these 8 verses of Langri Tangpa, and he was so moved by the depth and profoundness of this teaching that he knew had come from a teacher, that he set out on a journey to find this teacher. Now, when mind training is taught as this bunch of slogans, it's difficult to put yourself in that. I find it difficult to put myself in, well, why would it have moved him so much? And what I tried to do in my engagement with this practice of mind training, and hopefully in the book as well, is enter the dimension of what is it about these teachings that moved him so much that he set out on this long journey to find this person, to receive this transmission, that it's not about the slogans. It's not, mind training isn't some sort of repetitive method of mindfulness. It is a teaching that covers the entire breadth of the Buddhist path. And Chekhawa Yeshé Dorje must have seen this in these 8 verses, because he was a Nyingma practitioner. He must have seen that there was the essence of what he understood through practice that was being presented in a textual, is that the right word?
Textual.
Textual, doesn't that just mean texture? In the sense of a text. In something that could be conveyed, and that this teaching of a teacher that was an oral teaching, that it could be presented in a way that could benefit people. And that's why he set out to seek this teaching. And when I was studying for this book, and it took me 5 years to write this book, I tried to immerse myself in this teaching, in that style of, this is a totally profound teaching that I've got to cross continents or cross a huge vast country to find out about, because it is so profound. And I think that the way that it was presented to us in the 1980s as, well, you can just make up your own slogans once you've got this teaching, just so misses the point that that isn't what this teaching is. And hopefully in these next 6 weeks, through entering this dimension of understanding the depth of these teachings and their place in history, that they are based in the essentialized Vajrayana that existed in Tibet despite Buddhism being suppressed, that they arise from the Buddhism that survived through practitioners practicing Vajrayana in an extremely pure way and becoming extremely powerful practitioners. And that Chekhawa Yeshé Dorje did become a Geshe, we are told. When we were first taught his name, he was introduced as Geshe Chekhawa Yeshé Dorje. So he had that quality of a foot in both camps. He had a foot in the new monastic educational, studying in depth aspect of looking at the teachings, but also had his foot in the essentialized, raw, vivid, powerful Vajrayana practice that survived throughout that period in Tibet and is now known as the Nyingma tradition.
There's a question from Anita. Where did you first encounter these slogans?
Well, I don't want to mention any names because I don't think when we first encountered them it was a terribly wonderful teaching, but it was at a Gelug Buddhist center that we first came across these. And I think my feeling is that I started by saying we want to tame the mind, not tame the teachings. And I think there was very much a bit of a feeling that the teachings had been tamed, that they'd become a convenient method of telling you what you should do and what you shouldn't do. There's quite a lot of do's and don'ts in these teachings. And you have to enter those a little bit to understand why those do's and don'ts aren't there. They come towards the end of the 7 points. Most of the do's and don'ts are in the last point of these 7 points of Chekhawa Yeshé Dorje. But often the focus is put on that as the teaching, whereas the earlier points are presenting really the essence of the Buddhist path. And for me, the focus is more on that aspect and understanding why you need the advice, the 7th point. Once you've entered the dimension of practicing in that way, the first points of the teaching, why do you need to be reminded of those, don't do this, don't do that? And I've tried to look at it in that way. I hope that answers your question. So this have I set the scene successfully? That we have Chekhawa Yeshé Dorje, a Nyingma who took the opportunity offered by these new wonderful governmentally supported monasteries and entered into that study of practice. But I think the fact that he didn't lose touch with his Nyingma roots is confirmed by the fact that in his later years, he sadly didn't find Langri Tampa because Langri Tampa died before he managed to get to him. So he actually received the teachings on mind training from Langri Tampa's disciple, Sharawa Yongteng Dag. And he was the abbot of a monastery, and Chekhawa later on succeeded him and became the abbot of that monastery. But as well as that monastery, he also established a Nyingma monastery. So he never lost touch with his Nyingma roots. Now in this second spread, at the time of Yeshe O, the people who followed the teachings of Atisha called themselves Kadampas. So you may have heard this word, Kadampa. And 2 schools of Buddhism arose at this time, and that was the Shakya school and the Kagyu school. So they date back to that time. And they also had connections to the Gokar Chanlo, to the style of practice of introduced by Guru Rinpoche. They were not disconnected from that. So you will find this Gokar Chanlo style as part of the Shakya and the Kagyu tradition. It was only the Gelug tradition that came several hundred years later where you won't find it at all. And because the Gelug tradition became dominant, that is why it hasn't been well known about, but it was always there. So this this teaching, Chekhawa Yeshé Dorje started giving these teachings on mind training. And at first he gave them as an oral tradition in the same style that a teacher had given them, and didn't, and taught them quite privately, only taught them to disciples. And then he was told, this is a story, who can say whether it's true? It's inspiring, so it doesn't really matter if it's true. But he was told that lepers, who certainly wouldn't be allowed into the teachings, were sitting outside the tent and listening to these teachings and engaging in the teachings of mind training. And through engaging in these practices, they were curing themselves. Imagine curing yourself of leprosy through Buddhist practice. And so because he saw the great value of these teachings, he decided to write them down and to make them completely available. And this led to this synthesis of the teachings into the 7 points of mind training. Now, again, as I said earlier on, there are various versions of the 7 points of mind training, and it is impossible at this point of time to say definitively what the 59 slogans that were included by Chekhawa Yeshé Dorje were. It's impossible to say what those 59 were. And so in the book, I've got a chart at the end that includes some that are not part of the set that I've used, or where some have been joined into 2 or put in a different order or whatever. So if you're interested in that, you can find that at the back of the book. But this set of 59 is certainly a well-known set of 59 of the slogans that is the style of presenting this teaching in 7 points. And I translated 2 Tibetan texts to arrive at this presentation of these teachings of Chekhawa Yeshé Dorje. So that is the end of our hour. I hope this has been useful to you. We're quite happy to stay and answer questions if anybody has any questions or anything you would like to say, but this is the end of this session formally, and we'll start to look at the slogans and the 7 points more in the second session.
Which is in a fortnight's time, I think.
In 2 weeks' time. So thank you all very much for coming, and thank you for the questions. And we'll just sit here a bit, and if you want to ask anything else, you can.
Thank you. That was extremely interesting.
Oh, thank you, Peter. Thank you for coming. See you next time.
Thank you.
And you say, is there still active opposition to this day that you would call organized, or is it just like a historical thing that needs to slowly fade away? Or
yeah, I don't think it's organized. I think it's more that there is a prejudice that people don't know they've got, that is just kind of there. I mean, I think we've all got those in our lives. And unless there's something that rubs it, you're not aware you've got that prejudice. So no, I don't think it's organized or active. I think it's just kind of there, and people don't know about it or don't look at why something's made them react in a certain way.
A certain amount is cultural. Yabje Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche said that Jomo Sampol Dechen Rinpoche could not wear the white skirt out in public, even though her status would mean that she should be able to. It simply wasn't accepted by the local people. But what he did say to us is that you, Westerners, you can do it properly, you can dress properly, because the style of dress was not so well known in the West, and because we don't really mind what people think, so we don't have the embedded cultural prejudice. We can wear the robes as they're supposed to be worn, and then we can go back to Nepal wearing these robes and be able to display this aspect of Buddhism within that culture. So this may actually be helpful in many ways in overcoming that prejudice.
Thank you. It also helps understanding on why Rinpoche is a bit purist on the robes. It's a lot clearer for me now.
Yeah, because at the moment it's very important that we display the Gokochan robe. Very important, yeah. It's always surprised me that the tradition that was kind of out there doing the dirty work wore the white skirt, but the symbolism is that it's unbleached cotton, that it has that direct unstained quality of directness of the Dzogchen teachings and the nature of mind.
But it's good to display these ordinations. There are many different forms of practice, but when you go somewhere in public representing the teachings and you're an ordained practitioner, people will ask you about your robes. So we might go to some interfaith event and people will ask us about our robes, and it's an opportunity to make that bridge in terms of understanding. So it's very helpful to let people know that there are many different forms of ordination, and ordination itself isn't the only method of practice. You can be unordained and practice, and there are many different styles. But when you have a particular style of dress that goes with your ordination, it's good to be able to show it. There was a question from Paul Easton. Did we mean Yeshé Dorje, the weather maker? Yes. Ngakpa Yeshé Dorje was known for his ability to change the weather.
Yeah, I don't think I mentioned him though.
Oh, right. Well, he was one of the teachers.
He certainly was one of the Rinpoche's teachers, not Chah Rinpoche's teachers, yeah. I did meet him once.
Yes. Yeah.
But didn't have a close relationship with him. Our closest relationship was with Kyabje Shimi Rigzin Rinpoche, who we were fortunate to meet many times.
Right.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions coming up, I think we'll finish there. Thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and we look forward to seeing some of you sooner and others of you in 2 weeks. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.